Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we are continuing to look at the Jobava London system, and today we want to look at a game where black plays the move g6, particularly the move g6 on move 3. One of the ways that black can set up their structure to try to deal with the Jobava London system. And in today's game, we see things going very smoothly for white. This is essentially what happens when things go the way you want them to. And there's a pretty big gap between these players. Piorun Kacper has the white pieces playing the London system, and he's rated around 2630. His opponent, and I may have a little trouble pronouncing the name, but I think it's Szcurek, is rated around 2130. But that's still a very strong player. And even though there's a 500-point gap, there's a lot to learn here. In fact, sometimes when you have a bigger gap between the players, the strategic themes are more clear and easier to understand. And I believe that's true of this game. Let's begin with Piorun playing d4. Black plays knight f6, bishop f4, g6, knight c3. Now we have the Jobava London system on the board. d4, bishop f4, and knight c3. Black plays d5 to help keep e4 under control. e3, bishop g7. And so now black has his setup. This is very similar to a Grunfeld type setup. In fact, it's the exact same setup for black. White's pieces are the ones that are placed differently than they would be in a standard Grunfeld. So white's strategy is very simple. March the h-pawn up the board, open up the h-file, and attack down it. And it is up to black to try to do something about that. So white begins with h4. So here black has a couple of options. h5 is playable. c5, immediately counterattacking in the center, is playable. What the opponent plays in this game, however, is castles, is what we might call castling into it. He's saying, okay, I know you have an attack, I know it's coming. I think I can defend and beat you in another part of the board. So white goes ahead, plays h5, and black takes. Now, this is just a mistake. Even though it is a mistake, it's been played about 50 times in my database. And a lot of strong players, a lot of 2300 plus rated players, a lot of 2400 plus rated players have played this way as black. So even strong players play like this. So it's important as white to watch how the winning process goes. But white is just clearly better. White begins by sacrificing the exchange. The rook at h1 takes the knight. Pawn takes, queen takes. Usually we say the rooks are more valuable than a knight, but in this case, the compensation is more than worth it. And I know I have a lot of lines on the board here, but basically what's going to happen is white's going to play bishop to d3 to threaten mate on h7. The knight at g1 will go to f3 and then maybe g5 or e5. White will castle long and move that rook to the h-file and attack down that file. That's the basic strategy for white here. Black played e6, bishop d3, threatening mate on h7. Black defends with f5, blocks that diagonal, but it's an ugly move to have to make. The knight goes to f3, knight c6, and white castles long, with the intention of taking that rook, moving it over to the h-file, and attacking down that file. Black plays queen to e8. Now black would love nothing more than to exchange those queens and remove that pressure and keep that little extra material he received earlier. Of course, white's not going to do that. Now, this is an important moment. Watch where white retreats the queen. White retreats the queen to h2, and this is a very common theme in this structure, in this line. Basically, the queen goes to h2 to put pressure on the c7 pawn. The queen and bishop attack that pawn. Now, admittedly, the pawn is undefended at the moment, but sometimes it is defended. And the queen almost always goes to h2 to put pressure on that pawn. Now, some may say, well, I'm here to attack the king, not just capture some pawn on the side of the board. Why would I waste time recovering one pawn when I'm already down a full exchange and delay the attack? Well, that's fair. However, that's quite an important pawn. That's the pawn black would use to attack white's central structure. That's where the lever comes to try to gain some pressure on white's position, open up that dark squared bishop at g7. So that's a very valuable pawn to grab, actually. So it's worth it to put some pressure on it. So remember that queen to h2 retreat down that file in this Jobava London position. The bishop goes to d7. White plays a3. What he's trying to do is keep that knight out of b4. He doesn't want that knight harassing the bishop at d3. Now, at the moment, that bishop doesn't look very good. It's blocked by that pawn on f5. So what? Well, what White wants to do is play the pawn to g4 and open up that diagonal. So while it's blocked at the present, soon it will be opened up, potentially. And White wants to preserve the bishop, plays a3 to keep the knight out of b4. The queen goes to g6, g4. Beautiful. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. If the pawn takes, White would just take the queen, so he can't do that. And if the queen takes, he can play the rook to g1. Now he's got an open g and h file pressing down against Black's king. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Black does take on g4. The first thing White does, of course, is protect the knight at f3. That is under attack. So bishop to e2. The open g file isn't going anywhere, so he can take time. Queen goes back to g6, rook to g1. And now the heavy pieces are on those two files. The queen moves to f6. Bishop goes to g5. That bishop wants to eventually go to h6 and take advantage of that pin of the bishop at g7. But first he wants to kick the queen to a less comfortable square. The queen goes to g6. Now the bishop just goes to h6, and it doesn't really change anything. The queen can't take that bishop, because then queen takes queen, and it would just lose the queen. The bishop cannot retake because it's pinned by the rook at g1, so he can't just take the bishop. Rook to f6, bishop takes g7, queen takes g1 check. He's got to get something in exchange for his material, so he goes ahead and takes that rook. Knight to g1. He doesn't want rook to g6 after the queen retakes. King takes g7. Now queen takes c7. The pawn finally falls. White is also attacking the bishop at d7. So the material imbalance is White is up a queen and one minor piece in exchange for Black's two rooks. And that's a pretty sizable material advantage, but much more than that. The king safety, Black's king is still not safe, and his pieces are really uncoordinated. White's queen is right in the middle of the board, wrecking havoc. There's no way Black can survive this. The rook goes to f7 to defend the bishop at d7. The knight goes to h3. It can pop into the g5 square. It maybe can go to f4. It also doesn't block the bishop at e2, which it would have gone to f3. Rook to g8. Knight to g5, hitting the rook at at f7, excuse me. The rook has to go to e7 because it has to stay in contact with the bishop on d7. Queen to d6, just very irritating. I mean, Black almost has no moves at all. All the pieces are just frozen in place, sort of defending each other. Very rickety, very fragile position for Black. King to h6. Now White has a tactic. Do you see it? That's right. Knight takes d5. The pawn at e6 is pinned, and he cannot retake the knight. If he takes the knight at g5, then the knight at d5 would just take the rook at e7. So the rook goes to g7, e7 now. Puzzle time. White to mate in 2 moves. Can you see it? Sometimes long moves are the hardest to see, but that's exactly right. Queen to h2, check. King to g5, queen to h5 is checkmate. The knight at d5 controls that f6 square, so the king has nowhere to go, and the game is over. And this is a good example of how to attack the g6 defense against the Jobava London, particularly when Black doesn't take any special precautions and just lets you do what you want. It's always good in an opening to see what you want to happen under ideal circumstances, and that's definitely what happens here. I hope you have enjoyed this game, and please join us again at Chess Dog. We have more videos coming. Good to see you. Bye.